you've got essentially 4 points, correct?
Yeah, in the big picture, I think these four topics can strongly affect the Western worldview.
I think new worldviews and new perspectives are what we need. So go ahead and let's present those. Go ahead and present all of them briefly, and then let's go to the first one and let's really dig into that.
Sure. And this, what's interesting about this information, you talk about our culture, our time, or moving from one faith to another. What this does is it describes the functionality of tribes and the emotional effects of tribes. And so now we don't even have to think in terms of shifting from one culture to another. We're thinking in terms of the whole big picture of what is culture? What is this emotional effect? So the four topics that I've sort of developed and gathered together over the last 15 or plus years. Number one, we have what I call team spirit, which is an acronym for tribal emotional art manipulation equals the sensation of spirit, or what we've always described as spirituality or gods, angels, or demons. That was an ancient way of describing emotional structures. Spirituality is an ancient way of describing how emotional groupings work within tribes. So the first one, we describe how tribes function through art. A lot of how our value systems are set within our each groups, that occurs through art media. And this effect works for all tribal sizes and ages. So we might have a group of 4 D&D players. This team spirit effect will be in play with that small group. It will also work at the city level. So a sports team will have this effect going on. And then at the state level, at the national level, and all the way to the religious level, which we start getting into worldviews, this effect is in play. So we're going to be able to understand our layers of tribal association or religion, however you want to phrase that. We're just talking about groupings of people who function under a certain art style and a certain art rule. That's the first one. The second one would be balance, the principle of balance. So in a lot of our ancient religions and philosophies, the highest philosophy, regardless of the God character that they use, the highest philosophy is balance. And for the Western world, that largely comes from the ancient teachings of Egypt, or the ancient culture of Egypt. And their primary philosophy was called ma'at, which just means universal truth or universal balance. And this passes into Judaism as emet. It's the same consonants. These languages didn't have vowel markings. So the consonants of mt, emet, ma'at. Judaism's word for truth, that if you read in the Bible and you're looking at the original text, it's always going to be emet. That's the same as the Egyptian ma'at. And that much more means balance. Now, when we hear the word truth, we think established information. We don't think of actual balancing like scales. And the scales of justice, this is referring to the balancing process. And so this balance comes through as what we know as math. So we look at nature, we look at the repetitions of nature, such as the golden ratio, and this becomes math principle, meaning the left side of the problem is equal to the right side of the problem.
Right.
And do unto others as you would have done unto you is a math problem. There's a left side, there's an equality, and then there's a right side. And so what we'll find is that math is the fundamental principle that we're trying to get to when we try to describe that through a God character. The God character becomes a mascot for the concept of balance. Sometimes we focus way too much on the mascot instead of the principle. So we can spend a lot of time looking at that principle of balance from Egypt, from Judaism, from Christianity, and from Plato. Because the Western world leans on two, or is built upon two primary philosophies. That is the Judeo-Christian philosophy, and Plato is understood as a founder of Western philosophy. So I always want to keep Plato in on this conversation. So that's balance. That's number 2. Number 3 is monoculture versus multiculture. And so what we have with tribal units is tribal units ultimately over time or quickly shake into 2 different modes of thinking. So you have the monoculture, which thinks in a much more of a male with the emotional guidance of narcissism, and then the multiculture, which is a female, it's represented in female governance, which is much more of an empathy culture. So there's a narcissist, forceful male culture mode of thinking and a feminine, empathetic mode of thinking. And this is shown through all of our prominent ancient world religions, but it's also shown in modern. It's also shown in modern psychology. So it's not, I'm not trying to push things into a romantic religious mode. I'm just saying this is an actual tribal effect that exists in a left and right culture within tribes. And ultimately, in all of our ancient stories, our great epic tales that pass through time, a lot of these are going through what's called a flood myth. So we've all heard of flood myths. We understand now that flood myths are worldwide. It wasn't exclusive to Middle Eastern religion. It's a worldwide story. But it's not. It shouldn't be. They're better called empire myths, because in these stories is a story of an empire that is abusive to a multiculture. So a monoculture is being abusive to a multiculture. The rich, violent, narcissist empire culture is abusing the empathetic, live and let live multiculture. And this is true of Plato when he told this important principle. He told it through the story of Atlantis, which is an empire versus a multicultural philosophy or story. Story of the Exodus is also a flood myth. When we see the rich, violent empire of Egypt abusing the labor of the multicultural workforce of Egypt, we see the exact same washing away of the empire. And this is true of all of these flood myths. There's some version of this narrative going on. Finally, we have the Aten crisis. So the previous 3 points have largely been philosophical. The 4th point is more of a historical proofing of this effect. And what we see is we do have the Judeo-Christian narrative of Exodus from Egypt and creating a new world culture. Now, at that time, 3,300 years ago, is roughly what Judaism says when this happened. At the same time, that was the height of the Bronze Age in Egypt. So we did have this sort of massive media conflict that occurs in Egypt. Now, for the longest time, for the last 3,000 years, we've only had one version of this story, which is the lore of Judeo-Christian text. So we have the Exodus story, and that's the only version we've had. However, within the last 100 years, with the sharp increase in Egyptology, we have found the other side of the tale, which is the Aten crisis of Egypt. And then now, in particular, when they discovered a city of Amarna, they found a big ruined, buried, hidden city in Egypt. It was first called Aten. That area is known as Amarna. So what happened was the priests of Amun-Ra in Thebes in the south were the monoculture. So they were the culture setters. They were the ones who set law or set what's right and what's wrong. And so there's that rich monocultural side. And then in the north, in the Nile Delta, where the labor could be done well, you have the multiculture in the north. And Egypt was known as the two lands. And so there was a northern culture and a southern culture. These two cultures got into a sharp media conflict. So the people in the north who were multicultural were much more based on science. Hey, we want to prove why we're doing these things. And Thebes in the south said, nope, it's just our religious structure, and you're just going to do it. I don't care if we can prove it or not. It's just going to be done. And so